Sunday Surefire Podcast. I'm your host, the Commish. Joining me today is the co-host, Aaron Downtown Brown,
Hey,
and the other co-host, Ethan Weaver.
Hey Mish, how we doing?
We are doing pretty well, boys. Doing pretty well. Last week we had Derek Brown of Fantasy Pros on here to talk some undervalued dynasty candidates, guys that you should be looking to acquire on the cheap. That was a great episode, and we're definitely looking forward to having Derek come back on the show, hopefully down the line. Again, a lot of fun. Check out that episode you can check it out on X at Sunday_Surefire, on our website at SundaySurefire.com, or you can get it anywhere you get your podcast, Spotify, YouTube, wherever the case may be. Make sure you check out that episode and hit that subscribe button to make sure you're not missing any Sunday Surefire content going forward as well. But where we talked about guys you should be looking to acquire last week, we're transitioning now to players that you should be looking to move away from on your dynasty rosters, or at least put them on the trade block to see what you can get back for those guys in your leagues. For this exercise, we're going to be going through the Fantasy Pros Superflex Dynasty rankings. So if you want to follow along with those rankings on fantasypros.com, definitely feel free to do so. And Aaron, we've been missing you on the show the last couple of weeks, my man. You're making your triumphant return from Europe. You were over there gallivanting and having a grand old time, and now you're back. So let's see what you did with all that time off here. Who's one dynasty player that you should be looking to move away from your rosters right now?
well, thanks. It's definitely good to be back. And who knows? Maybe I was scouting some more rugby players. That the Chiefs got a good one in the offseason too. So
Yeah, he was over there going to rugby matches in Europe. Love it.
That's right. But no, this should be a good episode, and with different cells in the dynasty space. And I think what I tend to do here is just try to look at guys that I think are valued a little too high, and not a lot. Oftentimes, two of the guys I'm going to say tonight, I actually really do like these players, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do in dynasty to really make a nice trade or a nice investment for your team, and just kind of how it's made up. So I think who I'm going to bring up is Devon A-Chain tonight. He's dynasty ranked 36th and 7th overall running back. So as I said, very highly ranked. I think A-Chain, like I said, I love the player. I love his skills. In love with his upside, right? I think me and Ethan were joking like, there's a lot to love when he's scoring 49 fantasy points a game and 25, 21, 23. He's like, is he ever going to score under those 20 points? But then again, with this size, we talked about, he's not really that durable, potentially, where, yeah, he did all that last year, only played 11 games. And, we can't forget about Jalen Wright. We've been pretty high on him, kind of looking maybe at that 1-2 punch in the future as well. So just overall, with Devon A-Chain, I think him being in that tier 2 range. I think if you're looking to shake things up, if you want to get a little bit more stability, that's something that I'm really pretty high on, is just trying to get a starting lineup that's stable. I don't really like sometimes those shaky weeks where you boom or bust. And I love my Gabe Davises, but he's not my every week starter as well too. So I think A-Chain, that this could be a time where you might even be able to get like a Devontae Smith or somebody in a trade, in a trade where you really speak up on how highly A-Chain is ranked, and maybe you find a fantasy owner that's really high on rankings. And sometimes, I'm not really too keen on rankings. Sometimes you can use that to your advantage. So I say, yeah, he could be a trade candidate, and maybe be unpopular opinion with you guys tonight, but I say, hell, like, you might even be able to trade somebody like Joe Mixon, who could be a running back, top 5 running back, which he's shown he's done in the past, coming on another high octane offense that's a 3-down back. And you might be able to get a pick in return as well that might help you in the future too. So somebody who's kind of can still give you fantasy points. You might be able to have a 2-year return on Mixon, even though he is getting older. But we know that running back tenure does not last too long anyway. So that's kind of my spiel on A-Chain. I say just take advantage of that RB7 ranking.
Ethan, are you trying to move away from A-Chain?
It depends where I am on my dynasty team. If I'm not a contender and I'm being real with my roster, I'm like, hey, I just don't have it in the cards this year. I think A-Chain is a perfect piece to move off of right now because I think you can get a really, really good haul back. And I think you can get a more stable asset for the long haul, like in a receiver plus or whatever that may be, whether it's future draft capital. But I do really like the player in A Chain. And if I am a contender, eh, I'm actually looking to acquire A Chain in some spots. I did this past offseason. I have a dynasty team that is ready to compete, and I just love the upside that A Chain brings. I know he's a little volatile week to week sometimes, but if you have some stability in other parts of your roster, I think A Chain's a perfect back to plug in to your RB1 or RB2 spot, and he can just pop off for 40 points. I just think A Chain is just so efficient. He was the number one ranked rusher per Pro Football Focus last year. His true yards per carry was number 2 in the league. His yards per touch was number 1. His juke rate was number 3 in the league. Breakaway run rate was number 1, and he had the most breakaway runs, which is runs over 15 yards in the league last year. He was actually number 6 in that category with 13. Um, so that kind of upside just doesn't come around very often. He's in a very high octane offense that they're going to move the ball. He's a guy that doesn't need to get 15 to 20 touches to make a big impact. I mean, he can score you 25 fantasy points on 10 touches. So I really like A Chain, and if you're a contender, I think that's the kind of upside that helps you win championships. And you need that kind of upside to help you push you over the top. So I'm okay acquiring A Chain if you're a contender, but I can definitely see moving on from him if if you need to bolster your roster, and you're kind of moving towards the back of the line, trying to get that your rookie pick up towards the top 5, maybe even number 1. So that's how I feel about Devon Achane.
Yeah, it really depends where you're at. If you're trying to rebuild, or if you're trying to in the middle and you're thinking like I want to reset a little bit, prime sell candidate like Ethan said. If not, and you want to win, he's a guy you should probably be certainly honing in on to go get here. Aaron, any last points on HN?
No, I just thought he was an interesting guy to bring up that I think you could do a lot with. And like I said, I like the guy, but I think he with the value he's at right now, you can get a nice return back.
Yeah, he's high up the list, so you're definitely right about that. If you want to move on from him, for sure. Ethan, let's kick it over to you, my man. Who you? I know you're sticking with the running back position, but who should we be looking to move away from right now?
Running backs in general are always sell candidates, in my opinion. If they start to get ranked highly as an RB1, back end RB1, it's definitely a potential good time to move on from them. Just because, like I said, running backs are very unstable assets. They go down and their value just tanks. I mean, look at Tony Pollard this time last year. You could have sold Tony Pollard for a huge return, and he goes from a top 5 running back asset to now I believe he's ranked according to Fantasy Pros RB23. So just a massive fall in value just in a year, and that's why you need to capitalize on selling these running backs when you can. Obviously, team dependent. If you're a contender, and not to keep repeating myself, but if you're a contender, obviously these guys will help you win. But you also need to keep the train and the dynasty moving along. So if you can get the right deal done, I think you can always move a running back. But my first sell candidate is going to be James Cook, who's RB14 according to Fantasy Pros Dynasty rankings. He's ranked a little higher on some of these other sites, but I just think James Cook is a prime sell candidate, just based on kind of what he put out there last season. He was a pretty efficient runner, but he was the only guy in town. I mean, the only other 2 guys in the roster were Damon Harris and the corpse that was Latavius Murray, and he still couldn't get past that 60% snap share. He was at right around 55. I know they didn't bring in a ton of more competition. They did bring in Ray Davis, who is a bigger back, has an 88th percentile BMI, who I do think can be a thorn in James Cook manager sides if he can develop maybe into their goal line back outside Josh Allen. But just looking at last year, PFF ranked him with a grade of 71.7, which was 30th amongst running backs. He was number 19 in fantasy points per game, and that's with him being having the 4th most rushing yards with 1,122, and he was also number 8 in reception yards at 446. So he had a pretty good season amassing yardage in the receiving and the rushing game. He finished as a back end RB1, RB11 in half point PPR, but he was such a volatile player last year. I mean, he would have some weeks where he was, I mean, a top 10 running back, but I mean, week 1, RB28, week 2, 11, week 3, 17, 13, week 4, but then week 5, he's 41, week 6, he's 30. And kind of the trend continues where you see just up and down volatility of James Cook. And just diving into the numbers, he only had 5 carries inside the 5-yard line last year. That was tied for 36 in the league with Zeke, Aaron's boy A Chain, Jalen Warren, and he converted one of those for a touchdown. I mean, Miles Sanders was the next ranked back at third at 40 with 4 carries inside the 5, and we all know how Miles Sanders did last year. He also only had 2 rushing touchdowns on the year, so he just didn't get a lot of opportunity near the goal line. 29th in red zone carries, which ranked 33rd, number 22 in red zone touches, and 27th in points per touch. So he just doesn't have a lot of the opportunity that we're kind of looking for in these high octane offenses. We want those guys, we want those running backs that are going to get the opportunity on the goal line. And he's just not going to get that. And now I think Ray Davis has an opportunity to maybe take on that role even more and hurt Cook in that area going into 2024. So just overall, Cook was pretty efficient on the ground. He was number 2 in yards per reception, 10.1, and number 5 in yards per touch. And he still was a back end RB1. So if I can capitalize on him being an RB1 in the Buffalo Bills offense, I'm looking to do that because I just don't trust James Cook going forward. Like I said, no competition for touches last year, and he only had a 55% snap share. So I don't think the Buffalo Bills are going to use him more than that. And I think he's a pretty volatile asset going forward.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not contending, it's an easier sell for sure for Cook. And I think even if you have him and you want to win, I think he's worth putting on the block to see what you can get in return right now for the reasons that you mentioned. So I think he's fair to bring up. If I'm trying to win, though, I think he is a player that I do want to go get. I mean, I'm not really overly concerned about what happened in the first half of the season last year. They made an offensive coordinator change in the middle of the year where they kicked out Ken Dorsey and Joe Brady resumed the play calling duties from there. And Cook, that's when Cook went on a tear, 4 straight games where he was a top 17 running back, including 3 in the top 10. So he had some really strong finishes right out of the gate under Joe Brady, who is resuming his duties as offensive coordinator for this Bills team entering 2024. And we're kind of at a weird time for the Bills. They're retooling. They obviously let Gabe Davis and Stephon Diggs go. They're kind of ushering in a new group here, obviously with Keon Coleman, and Dalton Kincaid will be very involved in that. But only adding Ray Davis really as the primary ball carrier, backup running back behind Cook. I'm actually intrigued by Cook. We always want pieces of high scoring offenses which the Bills certainly will be. So I'm actually looking to get shares of Cook on my team if I can get him cheap enough. So I think I'm a little more optimistic on Cook in the short term. Aaron, I know you're a big Cook guy, so keep it brief if you could with your James Cook love. But what do you have to say about him?
All right. Yeah, no, as you guys all know, I am a Cook fan. But I think you touched on it. I don't think his situation changed a whole lot. If anything, it really got better. I mean, they're gonna have a worse wide receiver core. So I think what that kind of spells that what we're kind of anticipating is a big year for Dalton Kincaid. And I think as we know, when you're dumping it off to the tight ends, you're probably checking down to running backs too. So I think there's going to be times where Josh Allen gets frustrated and he's going to be checking down a lot. And I think that just spells a lot of reception points for James Cook. And I know Ethan was mentioning he's not doesn't really get a ton of goal line work, which I think if you have James Cook, I don't think you're truly planning on it. I think you're really counting on his rush, his 60, 70 yards rushing, but with those reception yards baked in there as well to get you those 12 to 13 points per week too. So I do like James Cook again this year because I think his situation actually got better.
Ethan, do you think that Josh Allen's going to check down more? Because so far that hasn't really been the case, which is why I personally didn't like James Cook in the past, is because Allen doesn't check down, and he didn't really check down a ton last year either. So I guess, is that also how you see it? or do you think that's going to happen more going forward this year?
With Josh Allen, I just think the guy tries to make too many plays to check down at a consistent rate. Cook had 44 receptions last year, which ranked middle of the pack, number 17. So I don't think that number is going to increase a ton. Um, so I understand the love for James Cook because I do think he is a decent running back in a good situation in Buffalo, and they didn't do a lot, but I know he had a good stretch with Joe Brady, but I mean, just look at what he did to end the season. Week 16, RB 39. Week 17, RB 47. Week 18, RB 34. So, like I said, it's still volatile with James Cook. And I think he has to be very efficient to get back into the top 12, considering he's not going to get a lot of goal line carries and probably doesn't have a ton of touchdown upside. So if you're not getting that touchdown upside, you need to be efficient. You need to be just like he was last year. You need to be in the top basically 10 in yards rushing and yards receiving. And that's kind of what he did. So that's why I'm a little hesitant with James Cook. And if I can flip him and get a safer asset, that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, and running backs are going to be a theme on tonight's shows for the reason that Ethan mentioned earlier. So some good points there on James Cook. We'll leave it there. We'll leave that conversation there, and we'll actually go over to another running back. I want to talk about Josh Jacobs here of the Green Bay Packers. He's 63rd overall on the Fantasy Pros Dynasty Superflex list, and good for RB15 as well. He's 26 years old, which is not necessarily ancient for a running back, but he's also amassed 1,502 career touches on his frame, and what we saw from him when he was on the field in 2023 to me was a little concerning. He was number one in opportunity share, meaning he was getting a ton of opportunities in his backfield, and number 5 in expected fantasy points per game, but finished with just 18th in fantasy points per game, so didn't live up to that metric there. Despite the heavy workload, he was just 50th in yards per touch, 53rd in juke rate, 48th in breakaway run rate, and PFF had him graded as the 50th running back in the league in 2023. So stats definitely trending in the wrong direction. He's also taken on an average of 22 touches per game in each of the last 2 seasons. So that's why the mileage is racking up on a guy over his first 5 years in the league. But I want to talk more so about his new situation here in Green Bay. Yeah, he got a flashy 4-year, $48 million contract, which sounds like a lot, but as we know at the end of these NFL contracts, the devil is oftentimes in the details, and the team can actually get out of his contract after 2024 and save a couple $1,000,000 against the cap in doing so. So he really is at a spot where if he plays well, they'll probably retain him. If not, they could look to go in a different direction. So they did the quote unquote commitment might not be as much as you might think it was if you just saw the headline, saw 4 for 48 on the contract. And on the surface, Green Bay, they are a nice landing spot with a good young core of developing players, particularly at the skill position players. But, if you look at the Packers running back room last season, they actually combined as a whole unit for 4 rushing touchdowns last season. And Jordan Love actually tied that group with 4 on his own. So, these teams, we saw this team get very creative in the red zone last season. And they saw Jaden Reed get involved down there. Some of the other receivers doing some things, catching passes as well. So it's very possible they go back to that. They're also going to have a healthy Luke Musgrave, presumably back this season, who might take in some of that red zone work too. So, and I know some running back injuries had to do with that, but I just think that there's additional competition in this backfield here. They re-signed AJ Dillon, who I don't think much of personally. He's more just an insurance guy who knows the offense. But they did draft Marshawn Lloyd in round 3. So they did at least put a young body, a capable young player that I know a few of us liked in the pre-draft process on this roster. So where Jacobs is a familiar name that not too long ago was winning people fantasy leagues a couple seasons ago, I think this is a time where you can kind of capitalize on him being moved to Green Bay and kind of get some decent value in return from a guy who's getting up there in both age as well as total touches on his body, and maybe pivot to a safer asset. So that's what I got on Jacobs, boys. Who wants to agree with me or maybe come at me a little bit? Let's hear it.
I'll jump in real quick because I'm kind of more on the green side. I know that. I was one where I sold pretty high on Jacobs coming off his RB1 season. As we keep talking about, it's very hard to repeat RB1 seasons in general. So I think you alluded to it that, the Marshawn Lloyd drafting or signing there. I think I think Jacobs is a good, solid running back that I think, this episode just keeps highlighting. Like, just keep taking advantage of, if you missed out on selling on him at his high point, maybe try to pitch, if you got a good dialogue back and forth with your league mates, try to pitch it. Say, hey, he's a Packer now. He's got a perfect opportunity. Pitch that 4-year deal or whatever. But as you said, most likely it will only be 1 to 2 years. So I think that's a great candidate to kind of sell the dream on it, as you said.
I do like Jacobs a lot this year. I think the Packers offense obviously is going to be much more efficient than the Raiders. I think Josh Jacobs is going to be the bell cow for them, but I do agree if you are going to sell Josh Jacobs, now is the time to do it because I think this is the last time you're probably going to be able to sell for something that's worth anything. Marshawn Lloyd's usage is just going to increase probably as the season goes on and definitely into 2025. So now is the time to sell. But if you were a contender and you decide to keep him on your roster for this year, which I am in a couple of spots, he may die in your roster because he's not getting any younger, and that touch total is just increasing. So I do think now is the time to move on from Josh Jacobs if you want to get something decent in return.
Fair enough. Aaron, are you sticking with the running back theme for your next player, or are you going to another position?
I'm not. I'm gonna switch it up a little bit. I'm gonna talk about wide receiver here. I'm gonna go with number 47 overall and number 20 wide receiver two, Nico Collins. I think he was. It's funny if you were watching the NFL playoffs last year and watching the Texans. Man, I know we were all probably excited. Like Nico was looking like a beast, right? Like he was coming down with big plays, especially with Dell on injury. Is really the main go-to receiver for the Texans. But as we know, in the offseason, they did sign Diggs. They have Nico. They got Tank. They'll have a healthy Tank Dell returning, Dalton Schultz, and Joe Mixon, right? So I think in the offseason, if you don't do any research, you don't really think about it. I think the common theme is just like I want to stay away from the Texans wide receiver core because I really don't know what's going to happen from week to week. But the more I dive into it, where if he's wide receiver 20, for one, he's ranked higher than Tank Dell. I really wanted to compare those two because they're the two main young wide receivers in that group. With as we know, Diggs is getting up there in age as well. So my take here is I really think Tank Dell is the guy to get, right? And for the reason where just kind of looking back at Tank Dell's his game in general, he really thrives at the slot position. Okay, so like weeks 2, 3, 9, 10, 11, there were a lot of his big weeks. He was demanding 10 targets, 7 targets, 11 targets, 14 targets, 10 targets, right? Um, in those weeks. And 42% of the time he's playing at the slot position, right? So I think when I look at with all these with the offseason changes, I really don't think Tank Dell role on his team changes, really. To me, Nico Collins' role is really getting, that's the most competition, right? Because he lines up on the outside the most, right? And so will Diggs, right? So I do know that Diggs is getting older in age too, but I think he probably still has at least 2 seasons left, and I really think there's going to be weeks that they really cancel each other out. But it's really Dell that Stroud does look towards in many games, as I said, just really running from the slot. And a very interesting thing to look at too is Dell's ADOT is over 14.4. So what that tells me is that he's a very dynamic slot player. He's not just getting short, choppy routes. He's coming down with long plays. He can really make a lot of plays happen, getting touchdowns. He's not just like this, short route, slant type of wide receiver where they're really moving him around, especially in week 10 where Nico was out and Tank Dell only ran 12% from the slot, obviously with Nico out last year on his injury. So I'm actually pretty high on Tank Dell. So I say take advantage of Nico Collins being ranked higher. And I think some of that is because people think of the unknown with Tank Dell because they're like, oh, that's just, there's a few weeks that he played well and then he got hurt. But I think take advantage of that because I think it shows when they were both out on the field. Stroud's favorite guy to go to was Tank Dell. And actually, I talked to ADOT. Collins during the weeks they were both on the field. His ADOT on average is about 11 yards, dropped down to 10 yards at when they were both on the field as well. So I expect that more to happen with Diggs now into the mix as well, where Collins could be the odd man out is kind of what I'm foreshadowing here.
Ethan, talk to me about Nico Collins and the state of the Texans wide receiver room. Tell us who's going to be the guy, please.
I actually think Collins may be a potential buy depending on kind of how you look at the situation, how you feel about these players. Obviously, Aaron, you like Tank Dell. So if you can move on from Collins because you think, hey, Tank Dell, a healthy Tank Dell and Stephon Diggs in the mix is going to obviously limit Collins. I understand that argument. But right now, the flip side, people might be thinking the same thing. Like, hey, Diggs is in town. Nico Collins' stock is way down. Maybe you can get him on the cheap. And just looking at what Collins did last year, I mean, he had 109 targets, which was ranked number 24th. So, I mean, nothing insane. And he was a top 10 wide receiver. CJ Stroud clearly liked Nico Collins. His QB rating per target was number 2 in the league at 129.6. So when CJ Stroud targeted Collins, most of the time they were hooking up. But I just think Collins was just he was a great receiver last year. I mean, he was very efficient. He was number 2 in yards per route run last year. He was number 3 in yards per target, number 9 in yards per reception. He was just a very efficient receiver and got it done. And like I said, he had 109 targets last year. I don't think his target volume is going to go down considerably with Stephon Diggs. I'm not a big Stephon Diggs fan. I think Diggs is more so. He's definitely at the end of his career, and I think he's slipping more than people want to admit. The Buffalo Bills have a Super Bowl window, and they let him walk. Right? They moved on from him. They traded him to the Houston Texans, and they were done with Stephon Diggs and his antics. So I think Nico Collins can still be that alpha X receiver that he was this past year, and I think you could see a potential buying opportunity if people think like you, Aaron, in terms of, hey, Tank Dell and Stephon Diggs may be the 1 and 2, and Nico is going to be an afterthought as the 3.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic in the Texans wide receiver room. Definitely one of the more polarizing topics so far in the offseason because when you have 3 capable players plus a capable tight end and Dalton Schultz in there with a good quarterback and CJ Stroud, who's only going to get better, presumably. It's people are kind of dug in on their guy in this room, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think fading the age of a guy like Diggs isn't necessarily the wrong approach here for a guy who turns 31 during the upcoming season. But Ethan, we're going to stay with you. You got one more player to talk about here. I know it's another running back. Who is it?
Yeah, it's my guy, Rachaad White. I do like Rachaad White, but I understand the running back position and the moment of opportunity you can sell. And I think Rachaad White is at that point, obviously coming off a top 5 fantasy season, crushed it this year for the Buccaneers, but we touched upon it last week with Debro. Rachaad White was very inefficient. Granted, I don't think it was all his fault. Per PFF, his offensive line grade was 29th out of the 32 NFL teams. So obviously not good. He had to do a lot on his own to try to get space. So I don't think it was all his fault. But I mean, he was second in the league in carries and was 14th in rushing yards. So obviously that's not great. He only averaged 3.6 yards per carry, which tied for 51st. Like I said, not all his fault, but definitely not great. You definitely want to see those numbers way up, at least over 4 yards per carry. He was also only 38th in fantasy points per touch. Again, Rachaad White was strictly a fantasy asset this past year because of the volume. And we harp on volume is king. And if you're getting the volume and you're scoring me fantasy points, that's great. But that may not be the best thing to bet on going forward with a profile like Rachaad White, because now Bucky Irving enters the mix, who's a popular running back amongst the Dynasty community out of Oregon. He was a round 4 pick 125, and he does a lot of things that Rachaad White does. I mean, he had 56 and 31 receptions his last 2 years at Oregon while averaging over 6 yards per carry. Bucky Irving didn't have a great combine, but guys like Kyron Williams didn't either. And Kyron Williams is a really good NFL back. And I think Bucky Irving has a chance to be a good back and eat into Rachaad White's insane volume that he got last year. So if Rachaad White was living as an RB1 strictly on volume, I think Bucky Irving might hurt that because I mean, similar to James Cook's situation, Rachaad White had nobody back there. He had Sean Tucker and Chase Edmonds, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were like, yeah, we're giving Rachaad White all the touches he can handle, unlike the Buffalo Bills. So I just don't want to be stuck in a situation like I was with Tony Pollard, where he had a great season. His stock is up, and Rachaad White's stock isn't even nearly what Pollard's was this time last year, but he still is coming off an RB1 season, top 5 finish. He's 25 years old. So now is the time to sell because I don't think his stock is getting any higher, and I don't know if that volume is going to last.
Yeah, it's a great call. I mean, you just can't bank on a guy getting 76% of his team's running back touches in back-to-back seasons. Especially a guy like Rachaad White. He's not Derrick Henry out there from a usage standpoint that could probably even hold up to something like that. But and with Bucky Irving doing a lot of the same things that Rachaad White does, completely agree on that. I think that actually means they want to mix him in there a little bit more. Because he can play in all
Exactly.
situations. And I've seen a lot of things out there on X and different platforms like, oh, he's just an insurance policy, or a guy who can spell Rachaad White a little bit. I just look at it completely different. Whereas you can see someone who, if you can do the same things as him, why are you going to run the guy who? Why are you going to run a guy into the ground if you have a backup who can spell him and do a lot of those things just as well? So, Aaron, any quick thoughts on Rachaad White or the Bucks backfield before we move on?
Yeah, I got a quick one. I think you got one thing over this situation. I think you got to look at it very holistically, take a nice approach to your team. Are you a competitor? Because I do think that Rachaad White does have a high chance of getting a lot of volume this year. Because I think when you look at it, a lot of the games last year, Tampa Bay was literally like fighting for their lives, like week in, week out. And I think when you got a running back that can run and catch, and your team is fighting the whole game and trying to keep up, I think that's perfect for fantasy, right? So I think if Tampa Bay's defense is still, if it drops a little bit, and as we think maybe the Falcons might be leading that division and Saints might be giving them tough games, they could be fighting for their lives again. So I think if you look at it just from a holistic view, there could be a chance he gets a lot of volume again, and I think Kamish, that could be a reason why he does stay in a lot because they're in it. I mean, as you saw, they're fine for the playoffs and whatnot last year. And I think that situation may be similar with that division being up for grabs the last couple of years.
I think with any running back room, if you can let your workhorse back, your main back, if you can let them breathe here and there, that's kind of what you want to do. You want to keep these guys fresh. I mean, it's a long NFL season. And just to harp on volume even more, last year Rachaad White was third in reception yards. He was second in routes run and third in route participation. So he was basically, I mean, the only running back on that team on the Bucks to do anything in the pass game. And that's kind of why I brought Bucky Irving into the mix, because I think Bucky Irving is going to hurt that volume that Rachaad White got last year. I mean, he was sixth in targets and fourth in catches. Rachaad White was last year. And if Irving can eat into that, it's going to hurt, obviously, Rachaad White in fantasy. But I do think Rachaad White is a good bet this year. I'm not saying he isn't going to be a potential top 12 running back again this year. I just think now is the time to capitalize if you want to get a decent return from Rachaad White, because this time next year, we might not be in the same situation.
Yeah, fair enough. And a new offensive coordinator coming in, Liam Cohen as well. So it is
Yep.
different dynamic than we saw White play in last season. So we'll see how that one pans out. Interesting one, and definitely some good points on both sides of it. I'm going to wrap it up here with another wide receiver. Finally getting away from the running back position a little bit. I'm going to go with Jordan Addison, Minnesota Vikings. He's ranked 62nd on this Fantasy Pros list, WR 24. So just sliding into the back half of the WR2 range. On the surface, you might kind of be wondering why Addison is showing up on a sell high list, but he was actually solid as a rookie. 911 receiving yards. That was good for third among rookie receivers last year. He was actually the only rookie receiver in 2023 to hit the double-digit touchdown mark. He did that with 10 in his 17 games played. But let's kind of look at the 2023 season as a whole for the Minnesota Vikings. Addison saw 108 targets. Again, a healthy mark for a rookie, but let's factor in what happened on that squad. I mean, Justin Jefferson, as we know, missed 7 games, left 2 others early due to injury, and still earned 100 total targets on the season compared to Addison, who played every week and earned a total of 108 targets. So there are neck and neck with targets. Jefferson presumably will be healthy in 2024 and beyond. And TJ Hawkinson also had a healthy target mark last season. He was actually number 1 in the league in tight end targets per game when he was out there. So he's coming back from an injury. Maybe he'll get off to a slow start if he even starts the season on the field. But both players are locked up under contract for several seasons going forward. So, I mean, in an ideal world here for the Vikings, Addison's going to settle in as their third wide receiver in the passing game, at least their third option in the passing game. And when we talk about this group here, let's not devalue the role that Kirk Cousins has played in all of this here. I mean, between 2015 and 2022, the guy threw for 4,000 or more yards 7 times over that 8-year span, and he was on pace for almost 5,000 yards before he got hurt in 2023. So after we saw a dip in Addison's production after Cousins was gone for the year, he got hurt in week 8, and over the final 9 weeks, he was only had two games in which he was a top 30 wide receiver in fantasy. So we saw the dip there, and that was with other injuries, like I mentioned, to Hawkinson and to Jefferson on the Vikings. And as this team transitions to either Sam Darnold maybe for a bit and eventually to rookie JJ McCarthy, we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. We can be as optimistic as we want, and I am optimistic on JJ McCarthy panning out at the NFL level, but let's not just presume that he's going to just come in there as a young player and be what Kirk Cousins was during his 7-year tenure with the Vikings. So all in all, I think there are some good things to like about Addison's game, but I just think with him being ranked around the 60th player here, it's just a little bit too rich for my blood. And if you're able to move on from him right now and kind of capitalize on that ranking and that solid rookie season, I'd be willing to do it. Assuming the return I can get for him is favorable.
I like that call just by the simple fact that I think his ranking right now, where he's being valued by the community, is a touch too high. We talked about Christian Kirk last episode. I think Christian Kirk is going to score more fantasy points this next year than Jordan Addison. And Christian Kirk, I know he's 27 years old. He still has more than a couple good years left in him. But Christian Kirk's wide receiver 38. If I can get Christian Kirk in a second or Christian Kirk plus for my Jordan Addison, why not? Why not make that move? Just looking at some of the other players behind him in the next tier. I mean, you have Rashee Rice, you have Ladd McConkey, you have Brian Thomas Jr. All these, you have all the pretty much a lot of the rookies outside that top 3 in that next tier. And I would honestly rather take a bet on any one of those guys over Jordan Addison. I think this offense, as you said, is not going to be nearly as efficient without Kirk Cousins. And Addison had a lot break his way last year in terms of injuries to kind of prop up his total. So I think that's a good call.
Yeah, and the other thing too, I mean, he finished WR 21 on the season, WR 29 in points per game. I mean, I would not be shocked at all if that's the best year that Jordan Addison has on his rookie contract, which is another 4 years in the league. So maybe that's spicy, maybe it's not. But while players do get better, and I like Addison's game, I don't want to sit here and act like he's not a guy who can't help you some. But I just don't see a ton of opportunity here once all those pieces are fully healthy around him, and it's also a big ask for JJ McCarthy to fill Kirk Cousins' shoes. Aaron, any quick thoughts on this before we close it out?
I love it. Actually, I really have no comments. I know it's kind of fun to hear the debate sometimes, but I'm with you here. And I know sometimes we say on our daily fantasy show, if we're all 3 in agreement, I think sometimes it makes a stronger opinion too. So, yeah, I like Addison as a sell candidate as well.
All right. We'll get out of here on the same page then, boys. Until next time, folks. Peace.